Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. As you can tell, I'm still having trouble with my voice. It just refuses to get any better. Very, very weak. My wife is setting up an appointment for me with a specialist so that we can figure out what in the world's going on. I mean, it's been 7 weeks since I had strep throat, and it just seems this just doesn't want to go away. But we move on, all right? So again, thank you for being with me on this morning's Morning Musings. I want to go back over the territory that I covered last Thursday, because let me tell you what, folks, this is an incredibly, incredibly important issue. Now remember, we're focused on the subject of the absent master parable in Matthew chapter 25, 14 and following. I've been demonstrating to you that every single New Testament passage that talks about the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, are really based upon Jesus' parables of the absent master. And we have Matthew chapter 21, we have Luke 19, we have Mark chapter 13, we have Matthew 25. In 4 different parables, Jesus told about a man, a master, etc., going into a far country and returning. That motif is very, very important. And that means that when we come to the New Testament and we find the predictions of Christ coming the second time, that's the return of the absent master. And when we examine the evidence and we see that the return of the absent master is posited in a very, very specific time and a very specific context, then it means that Matthew chapter 25, 14 and following, unless you can prove that it's radically different from Luke 19 or Mark chapter 13, it means that Matthew 25, 14 and following must be applied to the same time and the same context. So I've shared with you in Acts chapter 3, 23, Peter spoke of Christ, and he says, whom the heavens must receive until the restoration of all things, spoken by all of the prophets who have ever spoken. Now, here is Peter, who has witnessed the departure of the Lord just a few days previously, a couple of months previously. And he's declaring that heaven must receive him until the time of the restoration of all things. Now look, don't fail to see, again, the importance of John the Baptizer as Elijah. Elijah was to prepare the way for the coming of the Lord. That's the coming of the Lord at the restoration of all things, because John began the restoration work. Matthew chapter 17, 10 to 12. But I digress. So here is Peter in Acts chapter 3 very clearly talking about the return of the absent master. Now, if anyone wants to deny that Acts 3 is the return of the absent master, then you're going to have to divorce it from Matthew 25. Nobody does that, right? So, the return of the absent master would be at the restoration of all things, in fulfillment of all that the Old Testament prophets, the prophets of Israel, had foretold. Now then, in Hebrews chapter 9, the writer says that the Old Covenant, the law of Moses, the temple cultus, with its divers washings, with its feasts, with its foods, with its drinks, with its divers washings. All of those things, do not forget, were types and shadows. They were prophecies of the coming better things. In other words, just like the Old Testament prophets foretold the coming of the absent master, the Jerusalem cultus, in its feast days, in its sacrifices, in its washings, etc., foretold what? The better things to come. Now, according to Paul, in Colossians chapter 2, 16 and 17, as Paul writes to Gentiles who are being pressured to observe the law of Moses, to be circumcised in order to be saved, Paul tells them, let no man judge you in respect of new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, which are. Now, we are told, and I used to teach, that the law of Moses, with the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, was nailed to the cross. My Sabbatarian friends say all of the ceremonial laws were nailed to the cross. That's not what Paul says. Paul says the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths were, when he wrote in AD 62, still shadows of the good things that were about to come. In other words, the ceremonial law had not been nailed to the cross. Just like the writer of Hebrews says that those carnal ordinances, those foods, drinks, all of which were related to the feast days, were imposed from the Greek word epikaimai, imposed as standing valid, in other words, until the time of Reformation. It means that those, to use the terminology, those ceremonial feast days would remain valid, having standing until, are you listening? Until they were fulfilled. Well, they very clearly were not fulfilled according to Colossians chapter 2, 16 and 17, and they very clearly were not fulfilled in Hebrews chapter 9, because the writer says, speaking of those things, they were imposed until the time of Reformation. Well, okay, what is the time of Reformation? It's the time of the fulfillment of those types and shadow ceremonial laws. The new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths. That's the time of Reformation. Oh, that's the time of the restoration of all things. It's the time of the coming of salvation. Oh, wait, Hebrews 9, those old covenant new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, in other words, would remain valid, would remain imposed until the time of Reformation, which is when those things would be fulfilled, which is the time when what they foreshadowed would become a reality. Well, when would that be? It would be the time of the coming of the Lord for salvation. Do we want to argue that the salvation here is not the restoration of all things? Let's keep in mind, restoration, apokatastasis, in Acts chapter 3, means to put things right, to put them back in their proper place or order. It was used, apokatastasis was used in medical terminology, medical writings outside of the Bible to put, you have a broken bone. You set the bone back in place. Okay? So the Old Testament prophets would remain valid, binding, and effective until the time of the restoration. The time of the restoration is the time of putting things right. It's the time of salvation. Just like the old law, the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, the ceremonial law, would remain valid until when? The time of Reformation. The word Reformation is the Greek word diorthosis, which is a direct synonym for apokatastasis. Just like apokatastasis, diorthosis is used in non-biblical texts to speak of, for instance, a broken bone being put back into place. Direct synonyms, ladies and gentlemen. And it was that diorthosis, when those new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, which foreshadowed the restoration of all things, would be fulfilled. They foreshadowed, in other words, the second appearing, the coming of the absent master for salvation. Restoration of all things, salvation. Old Testament prophecies valid until fulfillment. Restoration of all things. Old Testament ceremonial laws, new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, remaining valid until the time of salvation, the time of Reformation. Exactly parallel passages. Now, since the diorthosis is the time of the passing away of the old law, okay, because it would stand valid, binding, imposed until the time of Reformation, the time of salvation. But the time of salvation is the time of the second coming of Christ, the return of the absent master, which is the coming of the Lord of Acts chapter 3. But again, that time of salvation, that time of the diorthosis, would be at the end of the old covenant law. Now, folks, this is taught right there in Acts chapter 3. All of those Old Testament prophecies foretold the coming of the Lord for the apokatastasis. Jesus said not one jot, not one tittle of the law would pass until it was all fulfilled. So just like the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths would be fulfilled at the second appearing of Christ, those Old Testament prophecies would remain valid until they were fulfilled at the coming of the Lord at the apokatastasis. All of these agree. End of the old law. At the time of the Reformation, which is the time of salvation, which is the time of the restoration, which is the end, to be repetitious, of the old law. So, if you're going to put the return of the absent master in the future, that means that the entirety of the old law, every jot, every tittle, will remain valid, binding, and imposed until the return of the absent master. Okay, out of time. Thank you so much for joining me on this morning's Morning Musings. And naturally, we've got more on the flip side.